Hello folks, welcome to my YouTube channel, Watercolor Impressions. In this video we are going to learn how to do wet on wet technique in watercolors. I picked a countryside farmhouse in Burlington, which is located near me. I picked this scene because I want to show how you can simplify and use wet on wet techniques to create a moody painting. I'm also providing the reference and drawing template so you guys can follow with me while I paint. I also simplify the drawing so you guys can draw from it too. When it comes to drawing template, I highly recommend drawing from it, not to trace from it. And let's get started. In any watercolors, light wash is the first wash, so I'm taking Cobalt Blue and I want to bring it all the way down. So the first wash is really weak, so it also helps us to kill the whiteness of the paper. And I'm also being careful not going over the roof. And I also make sure that my canvas or the watercolor paper is wet. So because we are focusing on wet on wet technique, so in wet on wet technique, every color you put in, it melts and blends with it properly. So I'm taking a darker pigment of Cobalt Blue, that means less water, more pigment. That creates a gradient where the ground meets. So now I'm using Cadmium Yellow and Cerulean Blue. I don't want a green tube, so this gives variety of colors in it. So I'm just throwing away colors wherever I see it in my reference. I also see burnt amber in my palette, so I'm just throwing it away. And you can also see I also throw in some cat orange in there because it gives beautiful colors when it blends in. I also make sure that my paper is wet because we are doing wet on wet, and I'm not going overboard with it. So now I'm jumping onto the roof. The roof is a little bit of neutral tint and purple or Winsor violet. You can use any of those colors. And as you can see, when I did the roof, I'd leave some eyelets. I would be lying if I said I planned it. I just planned one of the eyelet, but other things are really accidental. But I just leave it there, so it gives a really nice look to my houses. And now you can see I brought that wash all the way down where the ground meets. You can see I haven't painted the midground or the foreground yet. You will see in a second why I'm doing that. So now I'm taking Cobalt Blue and neutral tint, and I'm just throwing away the color. Let's start adding midtones in our wash. So I'm using neutral tint, and one of our focal point is the house, so I'm making sure I'm spending more details on there. And my watercolor paper is super dry, so I'm adding a lot of water, and I make sure that my watercolor paper is still wet. So if I put some colors, it blends in and it runs through from top to bottom. But as soon as I see a hard edge in my painting, I'm just going to use a clean brush and just break it apart. Because this is called wet on wet technique. Even on wet on wet technique, you can just do this to break your hard edges. So I'm just throwing in neutral tint. And I'm gonna go a little bit darker in my wash now. So ultramarine blue, burnt amber. Even though I'm going darker now, in any watercolor and wet on wet technique, since our paper is really wet, when it dries out, the washes get lighter. So I'm keeping in mind I'm going stronger and darker on my tones. As you can see, I'm keep on tightening up the house. Even on wet technique, a lot of people ask me how much water do I have to use in my canvas or in a watercolor paper. You can see even though I'm putting a lot of water, the paint doesn't travel from my midground. It just stays there because I just want to collect the bead. You will know in a second why I'm doing it. It will make sense. I'm still throwing a lot of colors here and there because I want to have kill monotonous in my painting. So let's add a little bit of darker tones here and there. So our wash is getting a little tightened up. That means it's almost done. So let's paint our midground. So I'm mixing up Cerulean Blue with Cat Yellow, and I'm just painting the midground now. And I'm making sure leaving some eyelets here and there. These are intentional eyelets because the reason you leave intentional eyelets is to create some details at the background. When I showed this final painting to someone, they said I painted huts and tractors at the background even though it's just an eyelet. So I'm bringing the wash all the way to the midground and making sure that I'll leave some highlights for the farmer as well as for the horses. And I'm going to be, as it comes to the foreground, I'm going a little bit with a thicker pigment, and I'm using Cerulean Blue, Cat Yellow, and you can also see I also added a Cat Orange here and there to have some a little bit of color variations in the foreground, and it is also in my reference too. So I'm taking Viridian, Cerulean Blue, Cat Yellow. I also want to create a strong focal point, so I'm going really strong on the foreground. So since we have green in the brush, so I'm just throwing it in the background, and as soon as I add it, you can see I have some hard edges, so I'm just gonna get rid of it. Since our wash is really wet, so I can throw colors here and there so that it blends properly. I'm also using Cobalt Blue, and I want to create some kind of variety of edges in the background, so I'm kind of doing it, rotating the brush to create that edge, as you can see. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the tissue paper and take some of the paints off from my background because everything looks really flat. So as soon as I did that, you could see there is some kind of lighting and shadows there in the background. Especially I took off painting in where the darker area is, so that kind of created a good contrast. Now I'm jumping onto the farmer using thick pigment, no water in it. So for the shirt I was using Cobalt Blue, and for his legs NeutralTint. For this dog I'm also using NeutralTint. So I also want the farmer to looking at us, so it creates a nice compositional element in our painting. So for his face I'm using Cat Orange, and I thought of giving him overalls. After that I thought, like, let him make blue, so I'm just using thicker pigment of Cobalt Blue. And as you can see at the background, our wash is still wet, so even if you want to add some colors you could do it too. So I'm jumping onto the horse now. Yeah, for the horse I'm using burnt amber, and I'm throwing a little bit of burnt sienna here and there to have some color variations there. And I'm also making it going darker. As you can see in the reference, it also the darkest value in the reference too. So I'm going super dark so that it creates a really good lead in from the foreground to the midground and the background. As you can see, I also left some few of the highlights in the first horse, and it is accidental, but I usually keep that highlights and I'll just get rid of it if it doesn't look good eventually. I'm jumping on the second horse, so same thing, burnt sienna and burnt amber, but I'm going a little bit with a thicker pigment with less water in it, so both of the horses are really dark. And I also feel like it's not dark. As you can see, as I said, I also get rid of that highlight eventually, but I also want to make sure there's a highlight on top of the horse, so I just leave it there. So I'm adding a little bit of darker pigment under his belly, so it kind of creates a gradient, and it also creates some forms. Let's jump on to the fun part of our painting. I'm adding fencing using NeutralTint and burnt amber. When I add this fence, I also make sure and being aware of my perspective. As it goes away from us, it gets smaller and skinnier. And in the reference you can see our fencing looks super complicated, so you have to simplify so that the viewer can understand. I used to paint exactly what's in the reference, and eventually it gets boring. As an artist, you're just telling a story as well as sending a visual clues to your viewer. The less you paint, the more suggestions you give to the viewer, so that's really important while you paint. So now I'm just squinting my eyes and seeing that the values are right, but since it's a wet on wet technique, you can see even though we painted the background super dark, I went really dark on it, it became weak. When I checked my reference and squinted my eyes, I saw that my values are really weak for the house. So I'm glazing over using Cobalt Blue and a little bit of NeutralTint. This is a step a lot of beginners or a lot of artists miss it because they don't squint their eyes and check their values. That's why most of the paintings looks flat. And I want to make sure the house reads properly as well. As you can see, as soon as I glazed over, the house kind of came in the focal point. and it also gave a really good silhouette for our farmer. And I'm also a little bit working on the house, because there are 3 focal points in our painting: the house, the farmer, and the horses. So these are the 3 things when people look at this painting and people gonna look into it. The background, even though it's really weak, nobody gonna see it, because I'm making sure that we are creating a contrast in these 3 elements. So I'm adding NeutralTint wherever I see some darker values. So you can also see I'm keep building up the darker pigments, and I also add a little bit of darker pigments at the farmhouse where the ground meets, so it anchors the ground and the house together. And we are almost at the end of the painting. The only thing that's left is to add the shadows, then we can call this done. And for the shadows, I'm mixing up Cerulean Blue, Cad Yellow, and I'm also going to add a little bit of ultramarine blue and a little bit of purple in it. And I also want to create a cool shadow because it's a morning scene. Let's start adding the shadows. For the background, I'm keeping it really weak as it comes to the foreground. You can see I'm creating the shadows. My vision for this painting is to create a morning scene with crisp lighting, so that's my vision, so I'm going with it. And as you can see in the reference, there is no shadows there, and it looked quite boring looking at the scene. But whereas in our painting you can see we created a story, the farmer looking at us. I'm keep building up the shadows, still I'm happy with it. And we're almost at the end of our painting. So I'm gonna take some clean water and I'm going to brush it in the foreground just to create some blurry shadows. And I'm using Viridian, Cerulean Blue, Cad Yellow, and I want to create a shadow peeking through in the foreground. So that gives a really good lead in for us to get into the painting. As you can see, as soon as I added that, it gives an illusion that the focal point is our farmer, the house, and the horses. So this is a really good foreground element. So I'm kind of adding, wherever I see some darker tones, I'm adding details. This step, I'm just making sure, squinting my eyes, making sure everything reads properly. And for the house, I want to separate the front house and the back house. Even though it's a wet on wet technique, I want everything to look really wet. I would have made this scene everything wet, but I have done painting, made everything wet, and it looks so boring. When you do wet on painting, have some strong contrast. That's really important. So those fence, the horse, and the farmer creates a story, and it also gives a really good contrast in our wet on wet painting. So now I'm adding just highlights here and there. Wherever I see the highlights from the reference, I'm adding it. And I'm also adding highlights for the farmer based on our lighting. So as you can see, as soon as I added that highlights, the farmer came in the foreground and the house went at the background. So that's really important to add. So I'm adding a little bit of highlights on the fence. I'm keep building up the highlights, and I'm adding highlights wherever it makes sense. And even in back of my mind, I'm saying to myself not to overboard with my highlights. And I also want the farmer, the horse, to even bring them in the foreground a little bit into the elements. So the way you do it is just by layering pigments on it. So I'm going with a thick consistency with no water in it. So I'm just making them darker. Even for the farmer, I used Cobalt Blue, a thick pigment, and I'm just using white paint. And I thought of giving him overalls, then I thought I'll just give him a shirt. And that's it, folks. If you enjoyed this tutorial, let me know what you learned from this video. And what's your favorite color in this painting? What techniques have you learned today, and are we going to use it? Let me know in the comments. And if you have any questions regarding wet on wet technique in watercolors, you can write me at watercolorimpressions@gmail.com, or else simply comment below. And if you follow this tutorial and did a painting of this farmhouse, share it with me. I would love to check your artworks too. Thanks again for watching this video. Please like, subscribe, and comment below. And good luck with your painting, folks.